For everyone that's already in the AMA, we're going to give people a minute or two just to finish the registration and get online. But for those that are hearing my voice, thank you for being prompt. About another 30 seconds and then we'll kick this off. All right, I think we've provided ample opportunity for people to join, and it's perfectly fine if people join late. But let's get the AMA underway. First off, I want to say thank you to everyone that's joined today. We're very excited to have the opportunity to discuss the recent CDC and ASHRAE announcements, and we're absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Nardell's participation. As the agenda highlights on this slide, we'll cover the basics of the new guidelines, what it means for your organization, and then open it up to questions. For all those who have already provided questions, thank you. And for everyone else, feel free to ask anything of interest in the Q&A window, which you guys should see on the right bar. If we run out of time, feel free to reach out to me directly, ben@r0.com. Very easy, ben@r0.com. And I'm happy to follow up with any remaining or outstanding questions. So, as I mentioned, we're incredibly excited to have the opportunity to speak to Dr. Nardell, who is a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital and an associate professor in the Department of Medicine, Environmental Health and Immunology and Infectious Diseases at Harvard Medical School. The author of over 110 peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Nardell is a prominent researcher of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis with a particular focus on airborne TB transmission and control. He is currently studying the transmission of MDR-TB and the effectiveness of various control interventions in several research projects funded by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. He's also involved in a 5-year Fogarty Innovation Grant that uses new technological approaches to airborne infection control to train architects, engineers, and physicians in air disinfection methods. So what's going on and why are we all on this call? Two important authorities, ASHRAE and the CDC, have recently updated their guidelines specifically for mitigating the spread of infectious disease. While everyone is likely familiar with the CDC, ASHRAE is an incredibly important professional organization as well. Their standards typically become building code throughout the country. Both represent the first time either organization is putting a specific number of equivalent ventilation recommended for effective airborne disease mitigation. And it's also the first time that both organizations have backed UVC as a mechanism of enhancing ventilation rates. Dr. Nardell, could you speak to the influence of these two organizations, especially ASHRAE for those less familiar? And to what extent do these organizations work together? Or are they completely independent?
Thanks, Ben. First of all, one's bio online tends to not get updated, so I just want to correct a couple things that you had listed. I worked hard to get to be a professor, so I don't want to be demoted to associate professor quite yet. So I'm actually a professor at the medical school and at the Harvard School of Public Health. And my recent research has been really actually more about COVID transmission than TB during the past several years. But it certainly started, and most of my work was on tuberculosis, which is unequivocally an airborne infection. And as you know, it took us a while to get to that conclusion with COVID-19. To speak to ASHRAE and CDC, they are independent organizations. ASHRAE is a professional organization of engineers, the American Society of Heating and Ventilation Engineers, and has no particular federal government association, where CDC is squarely under the Department of Health and in the United States government. ASHRAE is extremely influential, not only in the United States, but globally, as a reference point for particularly, as the name says, heating, refrigeration, and air conditioning standards. And they have a elaborate process for achieving those standards. And we're going to be talking about a draft of one of them. This is not a done deal. CDC, of course, has its own bureaucracy and actually had a hard time during COVID, in the sense that, like the WHO, it wasn't immediately on board with recognizing the airborne aspect of COVID transmission, and took a little heat for that. And the lead ended up being taken, as you know, by Dr. Fauci at the NIH rather than CDC, which one might have expected. At any rate, CDC has long recommended ventilation, particularly for healthcare facilities. So the number that comes to mind is 6 to 12 air changes per hour for isolation rooms and procedure rooms, for example. They are independent. CDC is also influential, particularly in the infection control community, which doesn't look to ASHRAE particularly. But when they ask their engineers to meet certain standards, or when they're building a new building, it's ASHRAE that is going to be the reference point for building permits, et cetera.
Very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Nardell. So why now? Well, ventilation has been known to be a critical component of IAQ. Specific targets for transmission reduction have never been set. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the issue of IAQ front and center for years, prompting the necessary action from these organizations. While COVID-19 made us all aware of the issue, enhanced ventilation will benefit us tremendously with influenza, RSV, norovirus, and whatever the next viral outbreak may be. So Dr. Nardell, with your extensive background and research experience, how did the pandemic shine a light on your work? How, if at all, did it change your perspective or approach to your work? And just how big a deal do you think these new guidelines potentially can be?
So, you know, as mentioned, for much of my career, beginning in the early 80s in Boston with an outbreak of tuberculosis in a homeless shelter and another outbreak of tuberculosis in a welfare office, I very quickly got involved in airborne infection and airborne infection control, and had the good fortune of working with a pioneer in this area, Richard Riley, for about 18 years. So one of my early papers, in fact, having to do with the welfare office, called into question the limits of protection that building ventilation can provide. So this has been an ongoing interest. And, you know, if ventilation can't do it, what are the alternatives? And again, Riley and his mentor Wells had been involved in germicidal UV for many years. And so a good deal of my work over the past 40 years has been involved in germicidal UV to provide equivalent ventilation. So COVID comes along, and although in this country, people think of TB as something of the past, and to some extent that's true, although it's still with us. Globally, TB under non-pandemic conditions is the #1 infectious killer today. In South Africa, more people die of TB than anything else, period. Now, in the United States, it's much less common. So, when COVID came along, it was sort of flattened the field. Everybody was concerned about airborne infection, and things like germicidal UV filtration and other techniques, filtration, room cleaners, all became of great interest. And my work, people started reading my old papers, and it's been both gratifying and has kept me pretty busy doing webinars like this. And also we, as I mentioned, have been doing actual research in our research facility in South Africa on COVID transmission, and for the past several years.
Super helpful. Thank you, Dr. Nardell. So how different are these new guidelines? Prior to the new guidelines, ASHRAE standard 62.1, which was originally published in 1973, and 170 set the baseline for ventilation. It's important to highlight that when 62.1 was written, it was focused on two things: thermal comfort and energy consumption. And given we were just in the midst of the energy crisis, it makes sense. There was no consideration for infection prevention or whether a space was healthy. You can see in the table, which lists EACH requirements from ASHRAE, that across space types, significant increases are being prescribed. So Dr. Nardell, what is your overall sense of where the new targets landed? Are they realistic? Are they aggressive?
Yeah, so a couple of comments. And again, I'm not an engineer, although I've worked with engineers for my whole career. Pretty familiar with what we're talking about, but I'm not an engineer. And so take that into consideration with my comments. First of all, the initial guidance for how much buildings should be ventilated was set at Harvard School of Public Health by a researcher by the name of Yagi. And it was based on, believe it or not, odor control. If you have people in a building, how much ventilation do you need so that people are comfortable? It was also based on, heating and cooling, the need to deliver air, but mostly it was comfort. And so you don't need an awful lot of ventilation for comfort, to remove CO2, to provide oxygen, but most basic ventilation guidelines are based on comfort. And so early on, again, in this 1991 paper that I published, people were of the belief that if you had a, quote, healthy building, enough ventilation for comfort, that you have a healthy building, there should be no problem with it. But it was very clear that if you're generating a contaminant like tuberculosis or measles or COVID, that comfort level ventilation simply doesn't do it. And let me explain why. Essentially, what you're doing with ventilation is you're removing airborne particles. And it could be pollen, or it could be infectious agents. And we're talking about infectious agents. You want to get that concentration down to a point where the probability of infection is low. Now, clearly, that depends on how much is being generated. When you talk about comfort level ventilation, we each generate a certain amount of heat as an individual in a room. We each generate a certain amount of odor, sorry to say, and we each generate a certain amount of CO2. And so it's actually fairly straightforward to come up with how much ventilation you need to remove that, and it's based on number of people. So it makes a lot of sense to base ventilation on the occupancy or on the room. Either one works, but if you realize that it is based on the number of people, that how much you need, then that helps you set the ventilation. With infectious diseases, there's a huge variation in terms of how many infectious particles individuals put out. So when you come up with a number for ventilation, you're guessing what is, or maybe have data on how much is necessary to reduce the transmission from, I guess, your average infectious source to a level of protection that you're comfortable with. Can you remove it entirely? Absolutely not. No mitigation strategy is 100%. And I'll explain why that's true. But at any rate, when you go from these numbers of 6 air changes in a exam room or 2 in a waiting room to 40. And again, are we talking, let's see, we're talking about equivalent air changes or to 40. That is a dramatic change. And I would argue that there's probably no scientific basis for that particular number. This is probably a consensus number because, we don't really have the data on how infectious individuals are and how much ventilation, nor do we even agree, is there any number out there about how much protection is required or desired? 80%, 90%, 100%, can't get there. So at any rate, these are quite aggressive, and I would suggest fairly arbitrary, with tremendous economic and logistical consequences. The CDC recommendations, which are up here, of going to 5 air changes per hour, are not aggressive. That's a lot more than in normal buildings, but it is achievable, if not by ventilation alone, then easily with a supplemental either air filtration machines or a germicidal UV. But getting to 40 air changes in a waiting room is a tall order. And interestingly, in an exam room, I guess there's fewer people there, only 8. So I think, people sat around, experts, so to speak, and came up with these numbers. But if you ask, show me that this works or that where it comes from, I think you'd be hard pressed to do it. One just additional comment: the 6 air changes per hour that CDC used to recommend for a hospital room, that was shown to be, what they had was, 1 air change removes 63% of contaminants in a room, well mixed. The next air change removes 63% of what's left. The third air change, 63% of what's left. So you're always taking a portion of what's left. So that's why you can't really get down to 0. And it was determined that with a stagnant situation, in other words, no added contamination, that if you start off with contaminated room, you get down to 99% removal with 6 air changes, or maybe 99.9. I can't remember what the number said exactly. But the point was, but that didn't account for ongoing generation. So if you want to account for ongoing generation, you're essentially trying to remove particles at a rate that's considerably faster than they're being generated. So you need much more ventilation than under static conditions. And so, 6 to 12 used to be the numbers for hospitals. Now, for general public buildings, CDC is saying 5 air changes. So I don't think that's aggressive. These numbers are aggressive for office. 11 air changes in an office is a lot of ventilation.
Yeah. Very helpful. So what does this mean for you? Given virtually every organization is now faced with the prospect of being underventilated as per 241, what's the best approach for compliance? One, generally speaking, the same approaches we've had all along will be those that we can choose from to comply with the updated guidance. While HVAC will continue to serve as the foundation of any IAQ strategy, significant upgrades to existing systems will be needed to meet these updated guidance. As a reminder, as we saw with the last slide, classrooms requiring 8 EACH and healthcare and public gathering spaces needing 20 EACH and beyond are probably out of reach of the vast majority of HVAC systems today. Given the high standards being set by ASHRAE and the CDC, we see a strong case for UVC, especially upper room germicidal UV, which can add 10 effective air changes to a space and be targeted to the risk profile of an individual room. In fact, R0 has a customer that's achieved 18 effective air changes per hour with the use of our beam system. Dr. Nardell, given your extensive research on upper room germicidal UV, what are your thoughts on how organizations can meet the new guidelines? Is the sheer magnitude of equivalent ventilation it provides the reason you've studied it for so long, or are there other factors?
So I think one of the questions that we'll get to eventually is, what is an air change per hour, equivalent air change per hour? And then we can get to how do we equate ventilation? So as I mentioned, in a well-mixed room, it's engineering 101 that says that under a well-mixed room, if you take the volume of that room as ventilation and pass that through the room, you will remove 63% of the air in the room and 37% remains. The next air change removes 63% of that remaining 37%, and there's always a remainder. You're always removing 63% of what's there. If UV destroys or inactivates 63% of the infectious particles in a room, it has done the equivalent of one air change, and so we call it an equivalent air change. The same with a room air cleaner. It hasn't exchanged the air in the room, but if it achieves a reduction of 63% in the particles in that room, we say that is an equivalent air change. So I agree with you that typical ventilation in public buildings is challenged to produce more than a few air changes per hour. Frankly, room air cleaners are challenged to produce more than a few more air changes per hour without unacceptable noise and drafts, because they're trying to get all that air in the room through a box. It's very difficult. Upper room germicidal UV, in particular, uses the upper quarter of the room as a large disinfection chamber and virtually instantaneously disinfects that air. And then as the air from the lower room, moved by convection currents and movement and all kinds of other things that happen in rooms, moves to the upper room, it likewise gets quickly disinfected and comes down as purified air. Now, you've actually been quite conservative in claiming 10 equivalent air changes per hour. In a study in an actual hospital in South Africa, looking at tuberculosis, which is a little harder to kill than COVID, we showed that we could produce the equivalent of 24 equivalent air changes on top of the 6 mechanical air changes that hospital had. And with that, we got 80% protection, which is to tell you how much ventilation you really need if you have highly infectious sources. And, COVID, like a lot of other infections, seems to be particularly transmitted by super spreaders. So oftentimes we are dealing with highly infectious sources, and that's why mechanical ventilation is at a disadvantage when you're talking about the relatively small numbers of actual air changes that it can produce at enormous cost. So at any rate, germicidal UV, to me, is the only viable solution to achieving the kinds of air changes per hour that ASHRAE is recommending in this draft, not finalized. And it is the only practical way for retrofitting a building, and the only economical way, because each double. Keep this in mind: if you double the ventilation, you reduce the risk by half. So if let's say the risk is 100%, you double the ventilation, you're down to 50% of that risk. And you say that's still not good enough. Now you have to double it again. So that's 4 times the ventilation to get down to 25% risk. You want to get down to 12% risk, you have to go to 8 times where you started from. So each increment in ventilation gives you less and less protection, and at higher and higher cost, because you're dealing with blower speed, duct diameter, all of the things that are entailed in getting more ventilation. And there's only so much ventilation that we tolerate in a room. So to me, if you really want the kinds of numbers that are being proposed, then you have to go to an alternative technology. Now, in addition to germicidal UV, there have been a number of other technologies, bipolar ions, et cetera, none of which really have the kind of evidence behind them that we have for germicidal UV. So, again, I've been in this ballpark for working on this for 40 years, and we still don't have anything better. The one thing we do have is better is we have now LED sources, which will be more sustainable going forward than mercury, and also far UV, which is another tremendous advance in germicidal air disinfection.
Thank you, Dr. Nardell. So typical steps to compliance. We're not going to belabor this point too much, but we provided a general overview of how organizations may need to comply with these new guidelines. And we are still waiting for ASHRAE to provide details on just this. Steps 1 and 2 are basically determining your need. What's the gap between where you are and where you need to be? So what is your baseline mechanical output in terms of ventilation? And step 3 is to determine the best solution to fill the gap. Steps 4 and 5 are about implementing that solution and doing the monitoring and maintenance to ensure that you're providing the clean air we know we all need to provide to building occupants, be it students, employees, patients, or anyone else. Dr. Nardell, do you have any thoughts about what organizations should be considering? Does it come down to cost, efficacy, ease of installation, or is there something else?
What organization? What types of buildings?
Yeah, how should people think about making a decision about what technology, or evaluating the various types of technology? Is it cost, efficacy, ease of installation?
Well, it's all of those really. Let's take, for example, the school. Schools tend to be large buildings. They typically in North America are ventilated. They typically provide comfort level ventilation. The budgets are not enormous. There was a lot of money around, COVID money around, but that's pretty much gone. And so, and some people, including a colleague at Harvard, said, "Oh, all you need to do is put in MERV 13 filters and solve the problem." Well, indeed, just a comment before we go through this is that there really is no report to date of COVID in particular being transmitted through the ventilation system from one room to another where people got infected without any other contact. So in my view, and I stand strongly behind this, if COVID is not being recirculated, putting MERV filters in the ventilation system, although it may reduce pollen and perhaps some other infections like TB that can be recirculated, it's probably not going to do much for COVID. COVID is transmitted in the room where the infectious source and susceptible people are both residing. That's my opinion, despite all the recommendations for MERV 13 filters. And when you put in filters, you may reduce the overall resistant flow by increasing the resistance to flow and make things worse. At any rate, so implementing these things, it's all of the above. It's if you say, okay, I want to meet these guidelines, you call in a consulting engineer and they say, what are you doing? And mostly they're going to tell you, you need a whole new ventilation system with maybe larger ducts, larger blowers, and your heating and air conditioning bill is going to go through the roof, because if you're really providing that many air changes of outdoor air, which you want to bring in infection-free air, even though, as I said, COVID doesn't seem to be recirculated, the numbers that you're seeing are outside fresh air. So that is one approach. And when you realize you can't do that, I think the next thing and the easiest thing people think of is to put in room air cleaners. And when you start sizing the clean air delivery rate, which the ASHRAE document talks about, how much air is actually going through, it's sort of the same thing. What's the clean air, the outdoor infection-free air that's coming out of it? And you size this to the rooms. Oftentimes, to meet these guidelines, you would need, I don't know, 10 air cleaners, 20 air cleaners in a room to try and reach the numbers that are being proposed. And the final thing is, of the proven evidence-based technologies, would be upper room germicidal UV, where it is possible to generate high levels of air disinfection. Again, higher than R0 is modestly suggesting here, through, especially if you have a way to mix the air. So low velocity ceiling fans, for example, greatly enhance the efficacy of upper room germicidal UV. But in any case, I think you go through those operations. The problem, one of the problems we face is that very few engineers are familiar with germicidal UV. So, you give a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you call an engineer in, they know about ventilation. They don't necessarily know about upper room UV. So you're likely to get a blank stare when you say, okay, we want to go with UV. You have to find a knowledgeable engineer, or actually companies, R0 and others, are equipped to provide guidance in terms of how to size and install upper room germicidal UV or whole room FAR UV.
Super helpful. Thank you again, Dr. Nardell. I think we're at the Q&A section, so I'm going to pop over and we can start taking these one by one. The first question that I'm seeing is, the doctor just said there's never been a case of COVID that has been, contracted between rooms, rendering enhanced filtration useless and preventing COVID spread. Is there a source you can share for this statement? It would be very useful.
Thanks for that question. What I would say is that try to find a report of COVID transmission in a building from room to room, different floors, different rooms, where there's been no other contact. It's the absence of data that has been striking. And I've asked everybody I know in the business, are you aware of a case? The one case that happened in Hong Kong with the original SARS, and there may be another one as well, where you had a toilet seal, a vent that was dried up. And so the very high concentration of COVID that can be in fecal matter spread from one floor to other floors in a building through the ventilation duct. There you don't have a velocity, you don't have dilution. I don't know why COVID doesn't spread through ventilation ducts. And we recently showed in South Africa that it can be made to do so under extreme conditions, but we just don't have any reports. You'd think after 3 years that there would be case reports. And so if you find anybody on this line, if you find a case report, please let me know, because I've been looking for it. So how do you present that as data? There's no data because there's no case reports of it. I can't prove that there's no transmission, but I can't find any instances of transmission from room to room through the ventilation system.
Yeah, when we started the business, we were looking for just that, and we also could not find it as well. And the research was showing more and more that it was close contact or sharing the air in a room with a group of colleagues, patients or students, which was getting people sick or keeping them healthy. And so as we were trying to implement what we understood to be the highest efficacy solutions, everything we ideated around was in-room risk, and how do we reduce it the greatest amount in the most cost-effective manner that also takes into account greenhouse gas emissions and sustainability. Because one of the big trade-offs with just trying to implement HVAC alone solutions is the energy consumption associated with them. And we have a number of customers that utilize HVAC as their only solution to mitigating risk around COVID. And inevitably, everyone was telling us they were consuming 40% more energy per location, and they were consuming filters faster. But the OpEx was much higher than they had ever considered, and they were blowing through sustainability targets related to energy consumption and greenhouse gases. And so that really was the moment where we recognized the value of an upper room system built on LEDs. Our beam technology consumes about as much energy in a year as a laptop. And so that's really sort of how we started to ideate. It was against the dimensions of both efficacy. And as I said, we have a customer that's achieved 18 effective or equivalent air changes per hour in a room. But then also against the dimensions of what's going to be your total cost of ownership in taking into account energy and the like.
The U.S. Department of Energy has been very concerned with obviously maintaining a favorable energy situation in the United States, and they have been doing a lot of research on comparing ventilation and germicidal UV, particularly LED, as a way to reduce mechanical ventilation in favor of other ways of achieving safe buildings without inordinate amount of energy used to heat and cool outside air.
Next question was, can you discuss the potential use for far UV? I have an opinion. Dr. Nardell's is a better opinion, but I'll hand it over to Dr. Nardell.
So far UV is, in my view, a tremendous advance, but it is a relatively recent advance. It has been only since the very beginning of COVID that a technology that was sort of just barely off the ground started getting a lot of attention, a lot of research. And I'll say this, from my opinion, it is as effective as upper room UV, despite its much less penetration. It is so safe for occupants that it can be used directly into the room. It is right now costly. The sources are krypton chloride lamps, which are not produced in the same way as, for example, LEDs are, so the cost is higher. And it's been fairly controversial because it's new. Even though there is not a single study that suggests that it is likely to cause skin cancer if it's properly filtered, not likely to cause skin cancer or any eye irritation whatsoever, all the studies are favorable. There are still people who say, oh, it's only been around for a short while, we have to wait and see what happens. The physics is very much favorable. If it doesn't penetrate beyond the tear layer of the eye, it really cannot do any damage to the eye. And if it doesn't penetrate beyond the dead outer layer of the skin, it really can't do any damage there either. So I'm very hopeful that it will persist as a form of technology, and that there'll be other sources that are more economically useful. Right now, for example, in a nightclub in Boston that I've been involved with, we have far UV throughout that facility. It's in dental clinics, et cetera. So it's being in use, but there's still a lot of controversy around it. It can generate some ozone, so you need to have ventilation to get rid of that ozone, and that's not difficult to do.
Yeah, I echo Dr. Nardell's enthusiasm. We're big believers in the technology. All of the science has indicated safety levels that are, at the perfect sort of designation. There was a pretty seminal research piece that looked at modeling cellular damage to the 222 nanometer wavelength. And what they found was 30,000 hours of exposure to that one wavelength did less cellular damage to skin and eyes than 10 minutes in the sun in a mild spring day. So unfortunately, the limits associated with where the regulations are don't allow for sort of total exposure to it there's a cap, and that cap we expect to go up over time. But where it is right now is there's a couple of products that exist on the market that produce the wavelength safely. We have one, and there are other companies that use a filter to filter out everything but the 222 nanometer wavelength. But it is very efficacious. We recently did a test where the technology was implemented in a public restroom that had been dealing with a lot of odor issues. And we were able to rid the space of that odor. And because, UVC, kills all pathogen types. And there's no pathogen on the face of the earth that we know of today that has any resistance to it. So odor-causing bacteria is actually really easy. That's one of the things that I like so much about far UV is that you're dealing with not only air disinfection, but also surfaces. And that's a sort of a point where we can start moving away from chemical interventions and start implementing these light-based solutions. Next question is, what's the difference between an exam room and a patient room? I don't know if you know that, Dr. Nardell. I do not.
Well, sure. An exam room, I think also probably would include a procedure room, and it's thought to be a higher risk environment, although fewer people in it. And a patient room obviously is where there's a bed and a patient, oftentimes one patient these days, but in the past we'd had double, and still do in many places, double rooms or even 4-bed rooms. So those are patient rooms. And again, relatively few people in those rooms, as opposed to, and procedure and exam rooms are where examinations are done, and including some procedures that could be aerosol generating.
Another one for you. How is equivalent air changes per hour measured?
So that's a tough one. Basically, the way I've seen it done is, if you're doing chamber studies, for example, as has been done a lot recently at the University of Leeds with far UV, for example, you put in a concentration of bacteria, you turn on the UV, and you compare the difference between the concentration that's leaving the room with and without the UV on. By that reduction in a number of bacteria, you can say how many air changes would be required to do that. And it's a mathematical calculation that's easy to do. But obviously difficult to do that kind of experiment, and you can't not do that in a patient room. The other way to do it, and that's what we did in the nightclub that I mentioned, for example, we measured the dose that is being delivered by putting some UV sensitive film on people's shoulders. Shoulder is a good place to measure dose because it's in the breathing zone. And we measured that people in that room, having dinner and walking around, waiters and others, were getting the equivalent of 35 equivalent air changes in the breathing zone. Now, if we average that throughout the whole room, it would probably be less. And how do we get that? We measure the dose, and then we know for each particular pathogen from a number of studies what the dose is required to inactivate 90% of the bacteria under test conditions. We take those two numbers, the so-called Z value, how susceptible an organism is to UV, and the actual dose, and we get a equivalent air change. So in the nightclub that I mentioned, we're getting equivalent of 35 air changes, and at 5% of the tolerable dose. So I would just say that, Ben, that we, within the TLV, people walking around are not exposed continuously to the highest rate. We're getting quite good efficacy with 222 at very tolerable levels of exposure. Same thing can be done with upper room UV. And with that, oftentimes you need a computer model to tell you what the actual distribution of UV is in the room and what you're likely to get in terms of equivalent air changes. But there's no easy measure for equivalent air changes in a room as there is for actual air changes.
Very helpful. What is the origin of the name R0? It's inspired by the basic reproduction number, also known as R0, which is the expected number of cases generated by one infectious case. And the goal is to bring that reproduction number to 0 or as close to it as you can. But if it is at 0, one infectious case would lead to no additional cases. And so, R0 was started as a business to help drive that reproductive number as low as possible. Next question, what does enforcement and verification of compliance with the new guidelines look like? When, how, and et cetera? We don't know yet. The ASHRAE issued the draft and opened it up for public comments. The commenting period ended last Friday. And they're going to go back and sort through all of the comments to refine where they're going to come out with the actual standard. And once that is set, the organization will highlight and discuss the what compliance, verification, and all the guidelines. There was some mention, particularly around UV, around what compliance would look like with regards to ensuring the devices are operating and the like, but nothing has been set in stone yet. We're going to be following it closely, and so to the extent you all have questions, again, feel free to reach out to me or other contacts you may have at R0. But we'll also be posting on where ASHRAE comes out on our social media, and we'll also be sending some emails.
I would just add to that, Ben, that to date, even though there have been targets for ventilation, there is no army of inspectors who go out and determine whether or not a building meets standards. Should there be a problem, for example, that involve employees, OSHA might come in and they would say there is a problem with the ventilation, and they would measure it and say it's substandard. But that's sort of based on incidents and complaints. Certainly, new construction renovations, these kinds of numbers will go into the specifications for the kind of equipment one would need to consider to meet those specifications. But for existing buildings, I can't imagine what, as somebody said, what organization would actually be equipped to do any kind of random or systematic inspections of the existing built environment to see that buildings actually comply.
Yeah, at one time, one of the things that was discussed was for new construction, this being code, and then to the extent an existing facility was altered in any way, they would be expected to move it up to code. But again, we don't have clarity on that. And as Dr. Nardell said, it's not entirely clear who is going to enforce. But I think highlighting OSHA's rule, to the extent these are put into stone, and you have a facility or an organization that runs air at 1 air change per hour, or 2, and the expectation is they're at 8. Could there potentially be liability? We don't know. But what I would say about the U.S. is we're a very litigious society, sadly. What are the energy consumption and greenhouse gas implications of complying with the new guidelines? So I hit this a little bit. HVAC is very energy intensive. I believe the latest stat that I heard was about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from the building stock. So the baseline for commercial buildings is incredibly high from a greenhouse gas emission or energy consumption perspective. Those stats predate COVID and all of the changes that have happened as a result of COVID. And so I believe Dr. Nardell hit this, but you saw a move to higher MERV ratings, or the how fine the filters are. What that means is if you have a variable fan speed, system that can accommodate this more fine filter, you are going to be spinning the filter faster to get the same level of air changes per hour in the building, because it takes more energy, or you have to run the fan at a higher rate to push it through the finer filter. Many organizations that we knew that moved up the stack from a filtration level did so with a fixed fan speed. And what they ultimately saw was a reduction in the number of air changes per hour. So they actually went backwards with regards to that. But trying to intervene strictly with HVAC based on these numbers, and again, they're not set in stone, is nearly impossible. If you were in a room with 20 air changes per hour or 40 air changes per hour that's been built out with HVAC alone, one, it would be incredibly expensive, and probably entirely new ducting, many systems, but it would be like being in a wind tunnel. You'd have so much movement of air in a space, it would not be tolerable. And so, I think in many instances, we're sort of at the upper limits. As I said, with regards to the products that we brought to market, you can create an upper room germicidal UV system with trace mercury bulbs, which are basically a derivative of a fluorescent light bulb, and you could use LEDs. We went with the LED path, one from an energy consumption perspective, and again, one of our beam systems, which can add 18 effective air changes per hour, is the equivalent of this laptop in terms of power consumption. But it also, when you use an LED-based solution, the light engine output is not binary. It's not a 1 or a 0. It's not on or off. What we can do is we can increase or decrease the amount of germicidal UV based on the dynamics of the room, taking into account reflectivity and all the things that you have to be cognizant of. So in that respect, our solutions are bespoke. We will go into a facility, we will understand what your baseline mechanical or HVAC system is providing you, where you want to get to, we'll help you get there, and we'll do so with a system that's sort of very cost effective. The far UV light systems are also incredibly energy, are not very energy intensive. And so all of these types of interventions not only address the high risk problem, or the real problem, which is the in-room problem, but they do so with an energy and greenhouse gas profile that's way more attractive than an HVAC intervention alone. Is this going to be expensive for organizations? How to comply without breaking the bank? Yes, I mean, the answer is these systems aren't free. R0 is working very hard to continue to democratize access to it. What we mean by that is to build cheaper and cheaper solutions. You will see our product roadmap, which encompasses full room disinfecting units that are often used in schools as incident response or in healthcare facilities on a daily basis, as well as our installed products, which are IoT-enabled smart devices that wake up, they do what they need to do, and then they deactivate themselves when they're not needed anymore. These things are getting way cheaper. When we started the business, there's a company that is a pretty strong foothold in healthcare with a whole room device, and they charge $125,000 per system. The solution that we brought to market is way more powerful than that device, and that is measured based on how quickly we can get to a 4-log reduction, or 99.99% disinfection of 1,000 square feet against actual live microorganisms. We can achieve the same level of disinfection 2 to 4 times faster with our device, and we charge a fifth of what they charge for theirs. So there is an opportunity to really continue to engineer out a lot of the cost of these products. Today, there's not a viable solution to produce far UV through solid state, but we're hopeful at some point that technology emerges. which would further allow us to bring to market products that are even cheaper. But where we are with regards to the upper room systems, the Beam product and the Beam family, which we're going to be announcing another version of it pretty soon, is they're on a beautiful part of the cost curve where it is an LED and they're getting twice as powerful every year, which means we need 50% less to get to the same level of disinfection. So we're really excited about where we are today with products in terms of the price to performance compared to HVAC interventions and portable filters and things of that nature. But it will continue to get even more attractive as time goes on. The other piece I would just say is when we went to market initially with our suite of products, we built it with the idea that people would just buy these products. What we've come to realize is there's a lot of interest in OpEx model, or the ability to subscribe for the technology. And so rather than asking people to write a big upfront check, we can go into a facility and sign a long-term contract where, it's dollars a day. It is not very expensive, and you can achieve whatever it is your target, levels of disinfection or EACH. But I would just say, relative to HVAC and relative to the practicality of putting 20 portable filters in a classroom, where one is not typically even being used because of noise, I think we're in a really good spot.
Ben, I like the idea of leasing equipment, particularly because maintenance is such an issue that often gets neglected. And presumably, if one had a contract for putting in equipment, that would include regular maintenance, replacement, and all that kind of thing.
It does. And, obviously there's a consumable associated with the product. So, like a light system, you're eventually going to need to replace it. And so as part of our subscription, we maintain the device. We will replace the light engines when they're needed. And all of our devices utilize data. So they're sensors and then produce data. And then we represent all that in software to give our customers real perspective on their space. But the OpEx model, or this concept of paying as you go, I think is going to be a real driver in this space. We're running out of time, and we have a lot of additional questions. And as I said, we'll figure out a way to answer all these. Maybe I'll just stay up late tonight working on them, but we'll get everyone answers to this. There was a specific question around, do the new guidelines mention far UV? They do not. They just talk about UVC. And for those that are less familiar, UVC is a spectrum of light. It's not a particular wavelength. And so UVC would involve, the lower wavelengths, like the 220, 222 nanometer, up to, 280 nanometers. The R0 fleet utilizes the 254 nanometer wavelength for the whole room disinfecting unit, 265 nanometer light, which is an LED-based upper room system. That's peak germicidal. There's no wavelength that's more germicidal than that. And then, as I said, we have a 222 nanometer wavelength, which is very germicidal, but it's also human safe. So as opposed to creating this massive zone of disinfection above people's heads, you can have downlights that are disinfecting air and surfaces, like Dr. Nardell talked about with the club in Boston.
I do think that the ASHRAE document is a bit biased toward mechanical ventilation. At the same time, ASHRAE is coming out with a guideline for upper room germicidal UV. So, but that's a different group.
Yeah. We're down to 30 seconds. So let me see if I can do one more. What about the ozone production of 222 nanometer light? If really the continuous use safe for humans, how much? So the answer to that with regards to 222 nanometer light is yes, it can produce ozone, but there's also technology that systems can implement to get rid of the ozone. So you can actually use UVC to eradicate the ozone. What I would say is
more importantly, Ben, just 2 or 3 air changes an hour of ventilation, which you need anyway, takes care of ozone very nicely.
And OSHA, we have to certify our devices with UL, and so there is a standard with regards to ozone generation. So all the products that we sell sit below it, and so it's not the risk that I think you're thinking it is, although you would have to look at each product independently. So I just want to say thank you to Dr. Nardell. Really, it's just an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to learn from him and chat with him. As a co-founder of R0, he's one of our heroes, someone we learned a lot from in reading his research. And just, you know, the world is a better place with having someone like him helping to redefine safety, or what it means to bring people together in a safe manner. I also want to say thank you to everyone that joined today. I hope it was helpful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. We will figure out how to answer all of them for you. So that's it, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the day.